The room went dead silent when she questioned his authority. That's what Dr. Hargrove would say later, building his narrative one aggrieved word at a time. He would tell board members that Hannah Clarke had undermined him, that she'd stepped outside her scope, that she'd treated his medical judgment like an inconvenient suggestion rather than an order. He didn't know that the hands trembling as she sorted the 5:38 a.m. medication charts had once held a pressure bandage against a femoral artery while mortar fire shredded the concrete wall 6 inches from her face. He didn't know that the woman who arrived early, left late, and never spoke of her past had spent 14 years being erased from every official record in the Pentagon. Sacred Heart Hospital in Savannah breathes with the rhythm of fluorescent lights buzzing at 60 Hz, the smell of antiseptic mixing with burnt coffee that's been sitting in the nurse's station pot since the 11 p.m. shift, the cold stainless steel of gurneys lined against walls the color of old teeth. Hannah Clarke arrives at 5:30 every morning. Leaves at 7:45 every night. Speaks only when necessary. Has never once mentioned where she worked before Savannah. The medication charts lay in front of her, 12 of them, each one a small rectangle of laminated information that other nurses would glance at and file. Hannah read every single one. Date of birth. Allergies. Previous adverse reactions. Surgical history. Medication interactions. She organized them not alphabetically like the protocol suggested, but by injury severity and comorbidity, which meant her first patient would be the one most likely to crash, the one requiring the sharpest eyes and steadiest hands. 3 years at Sacred Heart meant 3 years of perfect attendance, 0 medication errors, and 0 complaints from patients. It also meant 3 years of arriving before the day shift could settle in, of reorganizing supply closets by injury protocol rather than alphabetical order, of positioning equipment the way it would be positioned in a forward operating hospital where seconds measured the difference between a salvageable life and a body bag. The jacket hanging in her locker bore the weight of small rituals. Every morning before her shift, Hannah touched the inside lining where a faded unit patch had been sewn with careful stitches, threads worn smooth from 15 years of being touched like a rosary. The patch showed a green beret insignia, the kind you could buy at any military surplus store, the kind that meant nothing to anyone who saw it except her. She moved through the pre-dawn corridors of Sacred Heart with the precision of someone who'd moved through much darker hallways, past closed doors that held broken people and broken families and broken hopes. The ER doors remained quiet for now. 5:48 a.m. The shift hadn't officially started. The waiting room was empty. The trauma bay stood clean and silent and ready. Dr. Hargrove watched her from the physician's lounge, where he sat with a cup of coffee that cost more than most nurses made in an hour and a tablet displaying the night shift's incident reports. He noted how she sometimes froze mid-step when helicopter rotors passed overhead, the life flight helicopter making its approach to the landing pad on the roof 3 stories up. He noted how she instinctively categorized trauma patients by mechanism of injury before even glancing at vital signs, how her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of a surgeon, not a floor nurse. He noted the small scar on her left forearm, pale and thin like shrapnel exit wound rather than kitchen accident. Her eyes were the color of a stormy Atlantic, the kind that had seen too much and would never show you any of it. He didn't like nurses who didn't defer. He didn't like nurses who questioned. He didn't like Hannah Clarke, though he couldn't quite articulate why to the hospital board, so he said things like competent but unremarkable and the adequate bedside manner and let those words carry the weight of something deeper, something about control and hierarchy and the way some people refused to accept their place in an order he'd spent 15 years building. The ER doors burst open at 6:14 a.m., and the quiet shattered. Paramedics rushed a gurney through the entrance with the controlled urgency of people moving something critical and fragile. The rotor wash sound still echoing from the landing pad upstairs meant this patient had come by air, which meant serious. The patient lay unconscious, his chest wrapped in field dressings that were already beginning to show through with blood, his left arm at an unnatural angle, shrapnel wounds visible along his ribs where the blast had caught him. The lead paramedic was already calling out vitals as the team moved. Male, mid-50s, multiple penetrating trauma to chest and abdomen, estimated blood loss 1200 milliliters pre-transport, conscious when we picked him up, lost consciousness during flight, vitals have been stable but we've got active bleeding from the left anterior chest. Hannah was moving before the words finished. She didn't run. She walked with the economical movement of someone who'd learned that panic wasted energy, that the fastest way to save a life was a steady pace and a clear mind. The trauma bay doors opened like a mouth swallowing the gurney whole, and she positioned herself at the patient's left side where the paramedics had documented the heaviest bleeding. Other nurses began appearing, the day shift arriving early because the ER always called everyone in for a trauma this serious. The team assembled with the practiced coordination of people who'd done this hundreds of times, one nurse managing the 4 lines, one cutting away clothing to assess damage, one preparing the ultrasound machine for the trauma fast exam, one pulling the crash cart closer. Hannah's hands moved as if on muscle memory, not hesitation. She gloved quickly, latex snapping like gunshot in the suddenly tense silence, and began her own assessment, starting with the airway. The patient's breathing was present but shallow, his oxygen saturation reading 88 on the monitor, which was not good. Not critical yet, but trending the wrong direction. She positioned the trauma shears in her right hand, ready to provide emergency airway access if his breathing deteriorated further. The shears bore an engraved call sign on the handle, Spectre, a name from a life that didn't officially exist anymore. She kept them in her pocket every single shift. "Allergy bracelet," she said. Her voice was low and steady, the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed without repetition. Another nurse reached for the patient's wrist and found the medical alert bracelet, twisting it to read the information. Penicillin. Sulfur drugs. Contrast dye. Hannah nodded once, filing the information. Penicillin and sulfur meant they couldn't use standard prophylactic antibiotics, which meant they'd need to notify surgery immediately if it came to that. Contrast dye allergy meant if they needed imaging with contrast, they'd have to use alternative protocols or pre-medicate extensively. She pulled the patient's chart from the paramedic and scanned it quickly, her eyes moving across the lines with the speed and precision of someone reading coded information that held life or death consequences. Previous surgeries. Current medications. Medical history. Everything she needed to know folded into a small laminated card. The patient's face was visible now that the paramedics had stepped back. The features were familiar in a way that made Hannah's chest tighten, though her expression never shifted. She'd read his name in 73 letters from her son during the Ramadi deployment. Colonel James Mitchell. The man her son called the most decorated commander in the battalion. The man whose leadership had kept her son alive through 214 days in Anbar province. The man standing in the family photo her son had sent from forward operating base Shank, both of them in desert tan with the kind of smile that only came from soldiers who knew they'd made it through another day that could have killed them. Dr. Hargrove appeared in the trauma bay doorway, his presence carrying the weight of institutional authority. He was tall, with the kind of jawline that could cut glass and the kind of bearing that announced he'd never questioned whether a room belonged to him. "What do we have?" he demanded, his voice the voice of someone accustomed to being answered immediately. "Multiple penetrating trauma," Hannah said without looking up from the chart. "Shrapnel wounds across the left anterior chest, active bleeding, field dressing applied approximately 30 minutes ago, patient was conscious at scene, lost consciousness during transport, current O2 sat 88 and holding, vital stable but trending downward. Get him to imaging. I want a full trauma protocol CT, chest, abdomen, pelvis. And get surgery on the line." Hannah looked up from the chart. Her eyes met his for exactly 1 second. Patient has documented contrast dye allergy. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Dr. Hargrove's jaw tightened, and something flickered across his face, annoyance that she'd corrected him, frustration that the complication existed at all. He didn't thank her for catching it. He simply turned and walked to the phone to call the radiology department himself, already adjusting the order in his mind, already considering alternative imaging protocols. Hannah watched him go, then returned her attention to the patient. Colonel Mitchell's breathing had shallowed further. O2 sat was now 85. The trauma bay hummed with controlled motion. Equipment was arranged precisely where hands would reach for it. The ultrasound machine was positioned for the fast exam. The cardiac monitor showed a heart rate elevated but steady, blood pressure holding at 102/64, which was better than it should have been given the amount of visible blood loss. Hannah moved through the initial assessment with movements that looked ordinary to anyone watching, movements that looked like nursing. What it actually was, what Dr. Hargrove didn't see and wouldn't understand until much later, was 14 years of training compressed into a single shift, the precision of someone who'd kept 3 wounded hostages alive for 72 hours while coordinating their own rescue, who'd performed emergency procedures in basements and forward operating bases and places that no longer existed on any official map. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Colonel James Mitchell was alive right now because of what was about to happen next. Because of who was standing in this trauma bay. Because Dr. Hargrove was about to discover that the quiet nurse who never spoke of her past was about to become a threat to everything he'd built. The medication cart rolled closer to the trauma bay. Hargrove's hand reached for the ceftriaxone, fingers wrapped around the vial with the confidence of a man who'd never been questioned in his own hospital. Hannah's eyes caught the allergy bracelet on Colonel Mitchell's wrist, penicillin, sulfur drugs, contrast dye, the plastic band faded from years of wear. The contrast dye she'd already caught. But this was different. She stepped forward without thinking, her voice dropping low enough that only Hargrove could hear. Doctor, the allergy bracelet lists penicillin. Ceftriaxone carries cross-reactivity. Aztreonam instead. For a moment, Hargrove's hand froze. His shoulders stiffened. Then he turned, and the temperature in the trauma bay shifted like a door opening onto winter. Nurse Clarke, he said, and his voice carried the theatrical patience of a man about to perform. He said it loud enough for the colonel's wife and teenage daughter standing outside the observation window to hear. Did I ask for your medical opinion, or are you confused about which one of us spent 4 years in medical school? The other nurses stopped moving. The ventilators we seemed to amplify. Perhaps our little clipboard warrior here thinks 3 years of changing bedpans qualifies her to override physician orders. Is that the extent of your professional ambition, Nurse Clarke? Following protocols, or did you hope to practice medicine without a license today? The colonel's wife pressed her palm against the glass. Pity flickered across her face like a shadow. Hannah felt the heat rise, not anger, something colder and sharper. She'd been trained to absorb fire, to move through chaos without breaking. But this wasn't chaos. This was calculated. This was public. This was meant to diminish her in front of witnesses. She took one measured breath, let the oxygen fill her lungs the way she'd been taught in situations where breathing was the only choice left. Her eyes didn't water. They never did, not in front of people who mattered. But then she felt it, a single tear that came from somewhere deeper than thought, traced her cheekbone before she could stop it. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, her gaze never leaving Hargrove's face, and said, Colonel Mitchell is alive because I respected something higher than your ego, Doctor. She reached for the Aztreonam. No permission asked. No deference offered. She switched the medication herself, her hands moving with the precision that 15 years of training had burned into her muscle memory. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, that constant electrical drone that filled every hospital at moments like this, when someone crossed a line that everyone else was too afraid to acknowledge had ever existed. That afternoon, Hannah entered the break room with her lunch, a salad she'd prepared that morning from ingredients she'd bought at the market near her apartment, her ritual of control in a world that had taught her nothing was guaranteed. 6 nurses stood clustered around the microwave, reheating leftovers. The moment she set her bag down, they moved as if choreographed. One nurse grabbed her container mid-reheat. Another took her coffee cup. A third swept her plate from the counter. They filed out in silence, leaving Hannah alone with the hum of the refrigerator and the low mechanical complaint of the ice maker. Peterson, the nurse Hannah had trained personally last year, looked back for just a fraction of a second before following the others out. Their eyes met. Peterson looked away first. Hannah sat down at the empty table. She ate her salad in silence. She didn't cry. She didn't call anyone. She ate and looked at the wall and understood that Hargrove had already been working the phones before his shift ended. By that evening, a pristine white piece of paper had been posted on the break room bulletin board at precisely eye level where every nurse clocking in would see it immediately. The print was clean. The words were precise. The message was unmistakable. Disciplinary notice. Clarke, H. Insubordination. Failure to respect medical hierarchy. Unauthorized medication substitution. Hannah's name was centered like a headline. She stood in front of it for 2 minutes without moving. Her jaw tightened. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. Then she unclenched them, one finger at a time, the way she'd learned to do when emotions were threats to operational security. She memorized the notice's exact wording. She noted the time stamp at the bottom, for 11 p.m. She walked past it and clocked out for the day. The next morning at 6:15 a.m., before the shift briefing, Hargrove called the unit meeting in the main conference room. 43 staff members filtered in: nurses, respiratory therapists, unit secretaries, orderlies, physical therapy, the entire infrastructure of Sacred Heart's ICU. Hannah arrived exactly on time, no early, no late, and sat in the back row where she could see everyone's faces. Hargrove stood at the front with the disciplinary notice held in both hands like a document of historic importance. When a nurse believes her judgment supersedes a physician's, patients die, he began, his voice calibrated to sound concerned rather than cruel. We've built a culture of respect here at Sacred Heart, a chain of command that has kept this hospital functioning smoothly for 15 years. That chain of command exists for a reason. It protects patients. It protects nurses. It protects all of us. He held up the notice. Yesterday, Nurse Clarke decided that her assessment of allergy protocols mattered more than the physician's order. She overrode a direct medical decision. She contaminated the chain of command that keeps this institution running. He looked directly at Hannah. Clarke has demonstrated that she cannot be trusted to follow the system that keeps this hospital functioning. Effective immediately, there will be a review of her credentials and her practice. 43 people watched Hannah sit motionless. Nobody spoke. The air conditioning hummed through the vents. A phone rang somewhere in the distance and went unanswered. Hannah stood. Slowly. Deliberately. The room contracted around her. She opened her mouth and said 7 words with a kind of precision that made the statement land like a verdict. Colonel Mitchell is alive because I respected something higher than your ego. The silence that followed was so complete that even the fluorescent lights seemed to stop their electrical complaint. Nobody breathed. Nobody moved. Hargrove's face went white, then red, then white again. Peterson stared at the table. 2 nurses stood and walked out. One orderly nodded so slightly that if you weren't watching carefully, you would have missed it. Hannah walked out of the conference room and clocked back in for her shift. But that wasn't the worst part. Not even close. 3 nights later, when the code alarm screamed at 2:33 a.m. from Colonel Mitchell's ICU room, when the monitor displayed blood pressure dropping like a stone, 82/45, then 76/40, when the cardiac tamponade from a pericardial bleed that Hargrove's initial imaging had somehow managed to miss announced itself with the cruelty of malpractice, Hannah was already moving before anyone hit the overhead page. She ran to find Dr. Hargrove frozen beside the crash cart, his hands shaking badly enough that he dropped the pericardiocentesis needle twice, his voice fracturing like thin ice. "Someone page cardiothoracic, we need someone who can," but the words trailed into nothing because he knew. They both knew. The only person in this hospital who could save the colonel's life in the next 3 minutes was the nurse he'd just tried to destroy. 3 nights later, the unit was understaffed in the way that felt deliberate. 2 nurses had called in sick, both assigned to the trauma rotation, and Hannah knew better than to ask if Hargrove had made the calls himself. The double shift stretched ahead like a corridor with no exit. She'd been awake for 32 hours. The kind of exhaustion that made your hands feel like they belonged to someone else, though her mind stayed sharp. Pain is data. Exhaustion is just noise. The ER hummed with the controlled chaos of a Friday night, drunk drivers, diabetic emergencies, a construction worker with a nail through his palm. Hannah moved through it all with the same measured efficiency she'd shown for 3 years, the patch hidden beneath her scrubs a weight against her ribs. Nobody looked at her anymore. Hargrove had made sure of that. The nursing staff scattered when she approached. The residents avoided her station. She was becoming invisible, which was, ironically, exactly how she'd learned to survive. At 2:34 a.m., the alarm came through like a gunshot. The intercom crackled, code blue, ICU E3. Colonel Mitchell. We need all hands. Hannah's hands moved before her mind caught up. The unit patch seemed to pulse beneath her fingers as she straightened. For months Hargrove had restricted her access to the ICU. For months watching Colonel Mitchell through doorways, seeing the steady improvement she knew she'd made possible, unable to follow up, unable to check. The man whose life she'd saved had been kept from her like contraband. She ran. The ICU doors swung open to a room in controlled panic. Monitors screaming. Nurses bagging the colonel's chest while the resident, Chen, called out vitals with the precise urgency of someone who understood that every second was math. 28 minutes of CPR already. The colonel had crashed hard, cardiac tamponade, blood collecting in the pericardial sac, the heart's own protective layer becoming a death sentence. The pressure collapsing the chambers. 72 hours without intervention, and now this. A missed bleed on the first imaging. Then Hannah saw Hargrove. He stood frozen at the bedside, a pericardiocentesis needle in his right hand. The needle trembled. His other hand shook against his thigh. His face had gone the color of old drywall. He'd performed the procedure hundreds of times in his career, technically proficient, systematically cruel, but somewhere between the cardiac arrest and the realization that he was the only physician in the room qualified to do this, confidence had evaporated. His breathing came in shallow pulls. The hand holding the needle moved a quarter inch, then stopped. Moved again. Stopped. Hannah didn't speak. She moved. She was past him before he could form words, her hands already reaching for the ultrasound probe. The muscle memory didn't belong to her civilian nursing training. It belonged to forward operating bases and medical tents where electricity came from generators and the only certainty was that the next shock would come before you were ready. The Ramadi Field Hospital where she'd learned to do this under mortar fire, where Colonel James Mitchell had been brought in bleeding from a blast 32 months ago, where she'd moved with this same terrible precision while rounds chewed through the plywood walls. The probe found the fluid instantly. The screen showed what she already knew, blood in the pericardial sac, dark and viscous, compressing the heart into useless spasms. Hargrove stepped back. His hands were still shaking. He didn't leave the room. Hannah's breathing steadied. The world compressed to the ultrasound image and the space between the fifth and sixth ribs. The needle was still in her peripheral vision. She picked it up, it felt like an extension of her hand, the way instruments did when you'd trained your muscle memory in places where hesitation meant death, and positioned herself. The probe with her left hand. The needle with her right. Both moving like they were part of the same instrument. 8 centimeters, midline from the inferior tip of the xiphoid, Chen called out, reading the ultrasound numbers to guide the approach. Hannah had already calculated it. She moved with the fluid precision of an apex predator, each motion economical and absolute. The needle slid between the ribs. There was resistance. Then the give. The entry into the pericardial sac. Blood rushed into the chamber. The hiss of air escaping as the pressure released. Immediate. Visceral. Perfect. The monitor stopped its chaos. The tracing smoothed. A rhythm. Weak, but there. The systolic pressure climbed from the unreadable range. 82. 90. 102. The colonel's oxygen sat crept upward as well, 78, 85, 90. Real numbers now. Survivable numbers. His eyes fluttered open. Hannah stepped back, the needle still in place, secured. The work was done. The crisis was managed. She looked at Hargrove, who stood motionless against the far wall, watching her with an expression she'd never seen before, not anger, not arrogance, but something that looked like comprehension. The understanding that he'd just watched someone do something he could not. That if she hadn't moved, if she hadn't been in the room, Colonel James Mitchell would have died under his frozen hands. "Stabilize him," Hannah said, her voice flat as a command deck. "Cardiothoracic on standby." The orders came out without permission, without hierarchy, without the softening please or the deferential sir. She said them like someone accustomed to being obeyed. Like someone who'd given orders before in places where giving them wrong meant people died. Chen didn't hesitate. The ICU nurses moved with the smooth coordination of a well-trained unit. Hargrove watched. His hands had stopped shaking. By the time Hannah punched out at 7 a.m., the full weight of what she'd done had settled into focus. The sun was rising over Savannah in shades of copper and rust, and she sat in her car in the hospital parking lot, knowing exactly what came next. Hargrove wouldn't let this pass. He couldn't. She'd exceeded her scope of practice. The standing orders were clear, even though she'd been following the most basic trauma principle: the patient comes first. Even though he'd been there. Even though his hands had failed. The phone call came at 11 a.m. An external investigator named Phillips wanted to meet. The state nursing board had received a complaint about credential violations. Could she come in tomorrow? The tone was neutral. Professional. The tone of someone following a script they'd been given. Hannah knew this script. She'd heard variations of it before, in different contexts, always with the same outcome. The erasure. The questioning. The documents that didn't quite line up. The references that wouldn't answer. The gaps that couldn't be filled without classified clearance. By Monday, Phillips had asked her where she'd been for 30 months. By Wednesday, he was reviewing employment records from a government office that neither confirmed nor denied anything. By Friday, Hargrove had filed a formal complaint with the state board: unauthorized procedure execution, scope of practice violation, patient safety concerns, technically unassailable because nurses weren't supposed to perform pericardiocentesis alone, even when the physician was present but incompetent. Even when his incompetence meant death. The colonel improved. He asked the nurses about her. His wife tried to find her. Hargrove intercepted Mrs. Mitchell at the nurses' station, holding a bouquet of flowers, and explained that staff member under investigation shouldn't have contact. The wife's face had crumpled. Through the medication room window, Hannah touched the patch and said nothing. The termination papers arrived on a Thursday, hand-delivered to her house. Protocol violations. Unauthorized procedures. Credentials that couldn't be verified because the real ones lived in a military database under the classification Need to Know, and Sacred Heart didn't need to know. There was a non-disclosure clause, language she recognized from her Navy separation, the words that had turned her into a ghost, the agreements that had erased Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke from every record that mattered. She wasn't permitted to explain why she'd disappeared for 30 months. Wasn't permitted to describe the classified extraction that had gone wrong, the hostage situation in 2018 that had needed medical intervention beyond standard protocol, the reason her son had come home in a flag-draped coffin while she was still listed as on assignment to places that didn't officially exist. Hannah folded the papers with the same precision she applied to everything else. Then she called a taxi. The investigator's name was Phillips, and he conducted the interview in a windowless conference room on the 3rd floor where the air conditioning hummed like a warning. Hannah sat across from him at a steel table, her hands folded, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. Phillips had the bearing of someone who'd spent 20 years asking questions designed not to clarify but to expose, to find the crack in a story and wedge it open until the whole structure collapsed. He opened a manila folder. Inside were hospital protocols, medication logs, the pericardiocentesis procedure notes, and photographs of Colonel Mitchell's chest with the catheter placement marked in red. "Walk me through your reasoning," Phillips said. Not a request. His voice carried the same weight as an interrogation, each word placed like a stone on a scale. Hannah didn't move. Dr. Hargrove ordered a cardiac catheterization protocol despite documented contrast dialogy. The colonel was in septic shock. Blood pressure was deteriorating. You questioned the order? I asked for clarification. In front of witnesses. Yes. Phillips made a note. Then 3 nights later, you performed an invasive procedure. Pericardiocentesis. Without a physician present. Without authorization. The colonel was in cardiac tamponade. No one else moved. That's not an answer, Senior, he caught himself. Check the file. That's not an answer, Ms. Clarke. The way he said her name told her everything. They'd found nothing in her background to hold on to except the gap where her military service should have been. Redacted. Classified. Gone. A hole in her history that Phillips was treating like a confession. Dr. Hargrove sat 3 rooms down with the hospital attorney, Michael Bannister, whose name appeared on buildings throughout Savannah because his family had given $500,000 to the expansion fund in 2009. Bannister was lean, silver-haired, the kind of man who wore shoes that cost more than a month of Hannah's rent. She violated scope of practice, Hargrove said. A registered nurse is not qualified to perform pericardiocentesis. That's an interventional procedure. That's a physician's domain. Bannister nodded, making notes. And the initial challenge to your medication order? Insubordination. I'm the attending. My orders are not subject to debate by floor staff. But her challenge was medically sound. Irrelevant. Hargrove's voice hardened. Protocol exists for a reason. Chain of command exists for a reason. If every nurse second-guesses every order, the system collapses. Medicine is hierarchy. It has to be. Bannister set down his pen. The challenge itself, that's leverage. Frame it as her first act of exceeding her authority. The pericardiocentesis is the escalation. Together, they paint a picture of someone who doesn't understand her limitations. He pulled out a document. I've drafted the termination letter. Protocol violation. Scope of practice violation. And there's something else. He turned the page. Her credentials have gaps. Military service records are sealed. Nothing clear. That creates reasonable doubt about her actual qualifications. Hargrove smiled. It was the smile of a man watching his network activate, the board members he'd golfed with, the attorneys who owed him favors, the investigator he'd brought in to turn a hero into a liability. 3 hours later, Phillips completed his interviews. He'd spoken to Hargrove, to Bannister, to nurses in the break room who'd been coached on what to say. His conclusion, delivered in writing by 4:24 p.m., recommended immediate termination for protocol violations and scope of practice violations and recommended that further investigation into the employee's background be conducted by appropriate authorities. That's when the real letter arrived. It came on hospital letterhead, typed by someone in administration who'd never met Hannah but was following instructions from people who had. The letter cited specific violations, failure to respect medical authority. Performing procedures outside her scope of practice. Operating without physician oversight. Endangering patient safety through unauthorized intervention. But buried in paragraph 4 was the clause that made Hannah's hand still. Due to the classified nature of the employee's previous service records, which remain sealed by federal authority and cannot be disclosed or discussed by hospital personnel, the termination is effective immediately. The employee is prohibited from providing any explanation for the gaps in her official employment history or from discussing the reasons for the dismissal with colleagues, media, or other parties. Violation of this clause may result in federal legal action. They'd weaponized her erasure. Used the Navy's redaction against her. The very thing that had protected her, the classified cover, had become the evidence of her unsuitability. She couldn't defend herself without revealing the operation. The Navy had made sure of that 6 years ago when they pulled her out of Ramadi and told her son was dead and told her to disappear into the civilian world like she'd never been anything else. Security arrived at 5:41 p.m. with a cardboard box. the same guard who'd walked her through the main entrance on her first day 3 years ago, Rodriguez, a man with kind eyes who never asked questions, now walked her to her locker. Hannah packed methodically. A change of scrubs folded to the size of a textbook. Her badge clipped to a lanyard. The jacket, the faded one with the green beret patch sewn inside the lining, hidden where no one would think to look, she folded last and placed it in the box like it was made of glass. The world's best mom mug had a crack along the handle now, a thin line that had been spreading for months. Hannah wrapped it in paper towels and set it carefully beside the jacket. Beside it went the succulent she'd kept alive on the break room windowsill for 3 years through watering that happened at 6 a.m. every Tuesday and Friday, through neglect during the hard months, through the quiet discipline of caring for something green in a place painted beige and white. Last came the photograph. Her son in full green beret uniform, standing in front of a flagpole at Fort Campbell, his smile the kind that comes from believing you're invincible. Taken 2 weeks before the Ramadi deployment. Taken 12 days before the operation that killed him and erased her. The cardboard box weighed almost nothing. Rodriguez carried it like it might explode. The rain started as they walked to the employee exit, a November rain that came from the Atlantic and carried the smell of salt and brine. It was the kind of rain that Savannah gets when the weather can't decide if it's angry or grieving, so it does both at once. Hannah's scrubs were soaked through within half a block. Rodriguez said nothing, just walked her to the bus stop on Abercorn Street and set the box on the bench. "I'm sorry," he said. It was the first time he'd spoken since the locker room. Hannah didn't respond. Couldn't. The word sorry required a response, and responses require the kind of emotional architecture she couldn't access right now. Instead, she picked up the box and felt the water beginning to seep into the bottom corners where the cardboard had gone soft and dark. The bus was 11 minutes late. By the time the number 14 pulled to the curb, the mug had broken completely. Hannah could hear the pieces shifting inside the box as she boarded. She sat in the back, near the window where the glass was fogged with condensation, and watched the photograph. Her son's face wavered behind the plastic, fractured by water droplets running down the inside of the dissolving box. The bus driver had grey hair and the expression of someone who'd seen every version of Savannah's collapse, financial, personal, institutional. He watched her in the rearview mirror for 3 stops before looking away. Hannah got off at the corner of Victory Drive and Barnard Street, where the apartment complex she'd found online offered month-to-month leases and didn't ask questions. 3 flights of stairs with a cardboard box that was falling apart by the time she reached the top. The apartment was small, furnished with pieces that nobody wanted anymore. She set the box on the kitchen counter next to the eviction notices she'd been receiving for 2 months, notices from landlords who'd gotten 3 years of rent from her before her paycheck couldn't cover the balance anymore. She touched the jacket's inside pocket where the patch was sewn. The fabric was so worn it had taken on the texture of skin, soft and fragile from being touched so many times. She traced the green beret insignia, the upside-down horseshoe, the dagger, the words "De Represso Liber," to free from oppression. A motto for soldiers. A prayer for the people they were supposed to save. Hannah opened her laptop and began searching nursing positions in cities where Sacred Heart's reputation wouldn't follow. Tallahassee. Jacksonville. Somewhere far enough that a Google search wouldn't pull up news articles about the nurse who'd exceeded her scope of practice, who'd acted without authorization, who'd somehow managed to save a colonel's life while violating every protocol that existed to protect her career. The rain hammered against the window like Morse code, like applause, like judgment. Hannah didn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen counter all night with her son's photograph in front of her, watching his young face in the lamplight, and made a decision that would change everything. But she didn't know it yet. Not yet. 2 weeks later, a man with burned scars covering half his face, injuries healed badly, tissue grafted unevenly, walked into Sacred Heart's ER at 3:17 p.m. with acute appendicitis. His skin pulled tight across his cheekbones, twisted where fire had caught him years ago, a geography of pain written in scar tissue that told its own story of violence survived. Hannah was processing intake paperwork at the desk, her badge newly issued, the laminate still stiff and cold in her pocket. Contract employee. No permanent assignment. The hospital had rehired her with the quiet efficiency of institutions correcting catastrophic mistakes, new badge, same flaws, new title on her paperwork, clinical consultant for complex trauma cases. The lawyers had been very specific about the wording. The burn-scarred man's eyes met hers across the intake desk. His entire body went rigid. The Arabic came pouring out like a weapon, sharp, breathless, frantic. The same voice that had screamed commands at her while she lay on concrete in that basement in Ramadi, while his men held her wrists, while she counted heartbeats and memorized faces and calculated how long 3 wounded hostages could survive on intravenous saline and prayer. That voice. That exact timbre. That rhythm of command and contempt. Hannah didn't flinch. Didn't move. Her hands continued their work, form, clipboard, pen, while her breathing remained steady as a metronome. The man was shouting now, pointing, drawing the attention of 3 security guards and a resident. Her name wasn't in the shouting. He was shouting in Arabic about a woman who had been held, a woman who had escaped, a woman whose name appeared in classified files that had been buried for 6 years. And then the lobby doors opened. A man in navy dress blues walked in. Matthew Clarke. Her son. His uniform bore the insignia of a Master Chief Petty Officer, commanding presence wrapped in wool and brass, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade, Senior Chief Petty Officer. Not a greeting. A salute with words. An acknowledgement. A call to duty that transcended blood. Hannah's hand stilled. The clipboard lowered. She looked up, and her son held her gaze for 3 seconds, long enough for the intake desk to fall silent, long enough for security to step back, long enough for the man with the scarred face to realize who was standing in the ER lobby wearing the insignia of command. A naval officer in dark blue service dress moved toward Hannah with a folder. His name tape read Master Chief Hernandez. His hand extended the document with the precision of someone delivering orders. Declassified. 2018 operation. Hannah opened it. The words were sparse, clinical, accurate, how she had maintained 3 wounded Marines on 4 fluids and pressure dressings in a basement for 72 hours while feeding coded medical requests that became intelligence coordinates. How she had rationed morphine that didn't exist. How she had kept hearts beating when shock should have stopped them. How she had whispered to men in agony that rescue was coming, that she was coordinating the breach, that she had already fed her captors false information about which hostages could be moved. The file contained her name, her rank, her clearance level, the official record of what had been erased. A second officer stepped forward, Navy SEAL commander with the bearing of someone who had moved through darkness. His voice carried the weight of ceremony and recognition, 2 Bronze Stars for exceptional leadership under fire. He paused. The room listened. A Purple Heart for wounds sustained during hostile operations. Another pause. This one longer. And the Navy Cross for valor under fire and extraordinary courage in the face of enemy capture. Each medal landed like a stone in still water. Each one expanding outward. The man with the scarred face had gone pale. He was backing toward the elevators, his Arabic words dropping away into silence. He knew what those medals meant. He knew what Navy Cross signified. He knew he was standing in a room with someone who had survived captivity by outthinking her captors, and he was realizing with the kind of bone-deep certainty that comes from recognizing a weapon that he had just identified himself to the one person in the world positioned to end him. An FBI liaison in a dark suit moved to block the corridor. The individual in custody is wanted for war crimes under international law. The intelligence that led to the collapse of his network originated from classified communications coordinated by Senior Chief Clarke during the 2018 hostage operation. Dr. Hargrove was somewhere in that crowd. Hannah caught the movement of his face, the color draining like water from a vessel, the way his jaw went slack, the moment his institutional power evaporated. He had spent 23 years building authority through hierarchy and fear. She had spent 72 hours keeping people alive in circumstances that would have shattered most human beings. He was watching his career collapse in real time, understanding with excruciating clarity that he had terminated someone who held a Navy Cross, that he had publicly humiliated an operative so classified that her existence had been erased from federal records, that he had fired a decorated combat veteran in front of witnesses while that veteran quietly absorbed the humiliation rather than defend herself. Security appeared at his office door 3 hours later. Patricia Chen, Sacred Heart's administrator for 26 years, had made decisions with the speed of someone who understood institutional liability. The same security guard who had walked Hannah out with her cardboard box was now walking Dr. Hargrove out with an identical box. "I believe you know the way out, Doctor." 6 months later, Matthew Clarke drove through Savannah on leave, taking Abercorn Street past the bus stop where his mother had once stood in the rain with a dying succulent and a cracked mug. The corner had transformed into a farmer's market, white tents, vendors selling peaches and handmade soap, the smell of fresh basil and cut flowers drifting across the asphalt. A folding table near the parking lot held a banner, "Affordable Supplemental Insurance." Dr. Hargrove sat behind it in a polo shirt 2 sizes too large, handing flyers to people who mostly walked past. His eyes tracked movement across the street, towards Sacred Heart Hospital, where a new banner hung above the main entrance in letters that caught the afternoon sun, "Hannah Clarke Memorial Trauma Center." Matthew watched Hargrove's face as a news crew assembled for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Hannah appeared in the shot wearing navy dress blues, her decorations pin-precise and perfect, flanked by Colonel Mitchell in his wheelchair and Master Chief Hernandez. The reporter's voice carried across the street, "Senior Chief Clarke will serve as the Trauma Center's Director of Combat Casualty Care Training, bringing her experience from classified operations to train the next generation of trauma nurses." Hargrove carefully avoided looking directly at the ceremony. He focused on his flyers, his folding table that wobbled when cars passed, the Honda Civic parked nearby with a dented bumper and a company logo on the door. Matthew bought coffee from a vendor and watched the ribbon being cut. Hannah straightened her uniform for photographs, and he saw the transformation happen in real time, the shoulders back, the chin up, the quiet nurse replaced by the operator who had coordinated her own rescue while keeping hostages alive. She was someone else when she was recognized. She was someone else when the truth was no longer hidden. Matthew drove to Sacred Heart and found his mother finishing the interview. They met in the parking lot, not quite embracing, too many cameras, too many official eyes, but she touched his arm and said, "You came." He gestured toward the banner with her name. "Mom, they named it after you." She smiled, tired but real. "They wanted to name it after the mission. I told them the mission was classified." A photographer called out for one more image with Colonel Mitchell. Hannah excused herself and walked back to the ceremony, and Matthew heard Colonel Mitchell's voice reach across the parking lot. "Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns." The doors to the Memorial Trauma Center opened. Hospital staff applauded. And across the street, Dr. Hargrove packed his folding table into the Honda Civic, carefully not watching the celebration of everything he had tried to destroy, understanding finally that he had never actually held any power at all, he had simply been a man with a title standing in front of someone he didn't recognize. Did you know that most institutional failures happen because people like Dr. Hargrove never take 30 seconds to ask the quiet person story? Hannah Clarke's silence wasn't weakness, it was restraint. If you've ever been underestimated by someone in authority, or if you know someone carrying secrets that could change everything, please subscribe and share this video. And comment below, would you have walked away from that job, or would you have stayed and fought back? Hannah chose silence as her weapon. What would you choose?